The notification came at 2:14 a.m. A single buzz on a phone that never received personal messages, only encrypted business updates and coordinates for meetings that ended in blood. But this one was different. It was from an unknown number, a civilian's number. He's outside my window again. I think he's coming in. Victor Moretti stared at the screen. His first instinct was to ignore it, to dismiss it as a drunk text, a wrong number, someone else's problem. Then another message arrived, shorter, more desperate. I'm so scared. Please. Victor's breathing slowed. He had created fear in men twice his size. He had weaponized terror as a business strategy. But he had never felt this. A stranger begging for help because the system had already failed her. He typed only 4 words. Stay quiet. I'm coming. No questions asked. No explanation demanded. No time wasted. His lieutenant looked up as Victor grabbed his coat and walked toward the elevator. Boss, what's the situation? Victor didn't respond. He didn't need to because something in those words, that raw vulnerability reaching across the digital void, touched a part of him he'd buried under years of ruthless pragmatism. As his car sliced through empty streets, another text lit up the screen. I hear glass breaking downstairs. Victor's jaw tightened. His knuckles went white against the steering wheel. The city lights streaked past like tracers. By the time he pulled up to the suburban address, he already understood. Tonight, he wasn't arriving as a crime lord. He was arriving as the only answer this woman had left. And what he did inside that house rewrote the rules of his entire world. Stay with me until the end, because what Victor discovered on those stairs will prove that some lines should never be crossed. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Lily's phone screen blurred through her tears as she stared at the reply. Stay quiet. I'm coming. Her stomach dropped. That wasn't her cousin Maya's number. She'd been so panicked, so terrified when she heard the scraping at her window that she'd scrolled too fast, tapped the wrong contact, sent her desperate plea into the void. And now some stranger was coming. Some man she didn't know. Her hands shook as she started typing an apology, an explanation, anything to undo the mistake. But the sound outside her window stopped her cold. Metal grinding against metal. The window lock being tested, pushed, rattled with increasing aggression. Lily pressed herself harder against the headboard, knees pulled tight to her chest, phone clutched like a lifeline she no longer trusted. She could see his shadow through the thin curtains, backlit by the street lamp, tall and jerky and wrong. Brian Kwan had been following her for 3 months. First, it was just him showing up at her coffee shop too often, sitting 3 tables away, watching. Then he started appearing outside her apartment building, always with some excuse about visiting a friend nearby. Last week, he'd left flowers on her car with a note that made her skin crawl. You don't answer my messages, so I have to show you I care. She'd filed a police report. They'd told her to document everything, to avoid being alone, to call if he made direct contact. But restraining orders took time, they said. Evidence needed to be gathered. Meanwhile, Brian's obsession had evolved from uncomfortable to terrifying. And tonight, it had become something else entirely. Tonight, he'd stopped pretending there were boundaries he wouldn't cross. The rattling stopped. Lily held her breath, hope flickering that maybe he'd given up, maybe he'd leave, maybe morning would come, and this would just be another story she'd tell the police who couldn't help her. Then she heard it, the soft scrape of something metal being inserted into the window frame. He wasn't testing anymore. He was breaking in. Her paralysis shattered. She slid off the bed as quietly as she could, her bare feet silent on the carpet, and moved toward her closet. Her phone buzzed. 10 minutes away. The stranger's message felt both like salvation and another layer of nightmare. She didn't know who was coming. Didn't know if this mysterious responder was worse than the stalker now prying open her window. But as she heard the lock finally give way, as she heard the window sliding open with a whisper of cold night air invading her sanctuary, Lily made her choice. She crawled into her closet, pulled the door almost closed, and prayed that whoever was coming would arrive before Brian found her trembling in the dark. Victor's elevator descended through 47 floors of his empire in complete silence. The penthouse above housed the nerve center of an organization that moved millions in cash, controlled entire neighborhoods, and settled disputes with finality that courts could never match. But tonight, none of that mattered. His phone displayed a single blinking dot on a map, a residential address in a suburb he'd never had reason to visit, where a stranger's terror had somehow become his responsibility. The lobby doors opened to reveal 3 of his men already waiting by the car, weapons concealed, faces set in that professional readiness that came from years of following orders without question. Marco stepped forward, hand on the rear door handle. "Where to, boss?" Victor walked past him to the driver's side, his movement answer enough. Marco's expression shifted, confusion breaking through trained neutrality. "Sir, we should come with you." "Protocol." Victor turned, and the look he gave them carried decades of unquestioned authority compressed into a single moment. "This doesn't concern you. Stay here. Wait for my call." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more absolute than shouting ever could. Marco knew better than to argue. They all did. Victor slid behind the wheel of his personal car, not the armored sedan with bulletproof glass and reinforced chassis, just the sleek black vehicle he drove when he needed to think. The engine purred to life, and he was gone, leaving his men standing in the empty street like abandoned sentries. The city at 2:30 in the morning belonged to people with nowhere to go and people who controlled where everyone else went. Victor had always been the latter, moving through darkness like it was another room in his house, familiar and owned. But tonight felt different. His phone sat in the center console, GPS tracking active, the blinking dot his only destination. He didn't know this woman's name, didn't know what she looked like or why someone was outside her window or what he'd find when he arrived. All he knew was that she'd asked for help, and something in those simple words had bypassed every defense he'd built around himself. "He's outside my window again." Again. That single word told him everything. This wasn't random. This was persistent. Predatory. Someone had been terrorizing this woman, circling her like prey, and tonight had decided to stop circling. Victor's hands tightened on the steering wheel as another text came through. "I hear glass breaking downstairs." The timestamp showed it was sent 4 minutes ago. He checked the GPS 7 minutes away. Too long. Far too long. Victor pressed the accelerator harder, the engine's growl deepening as the speedometer climbed. Traffic lights became suggestions. Stop signs turned invisible. The suburbs approached fast, rows of identical houses with identical lives, and somewhere in that maze of normalcy, a woman was hiding while a predator hunted. Victor had spent 20 years being the thing people feared in the dark. Tonight, he would use that expertise for something different. Tonight, he would show someone what happened when they picked the wrong victim. The crash came from downstairs, sharp and final, the sound of safety shattering into 1,000 pieces. Lily's entire body flinched in the darkness of her closet, her hand clamping over her mouth to trap the sob that wanted to escape. He was inside. Brian Kwan was inside her house. The window in her bedroom had been bad enough, that violation of her private space, but she'd managed to slip away before he'd climbed through. Now he'd moved to the back door, and the glass breaking told her he was done being subtle, done pretending this was anything other than what it was. A hunt. She pulled the closet door tighter, leaving only the thinnest crack to see through, though all she could make out was the dim outline of her bed and the pale rectangle of her bedroom doorway. Her phone screen was too bright, a beacon that would give her away, so she'd turned the brightness down to almost nothing. The stranger's last message still glowed there. "For minutes away." Hold on. For minutes might as well have been 4 hours. For minutes was an eternity when you could hear footsteps crunching through broken glass below you, when you could hear someone moving through your kitchen, opening doors, searching. Lily had never understood true fear before tonight. She'd been anxious, worried, uncomfortable during Brian's months of stalking, but this was different. This was primal. Her nervous system had taken over, flooding her with adrenaline that made her hands shake and her vision tunnel and her breath come in short, silent gasps that never felt like enough oxygen. She was prey. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Her bedroom was on the 2nd floor. The window led to a drop that would break her ankles. The only exit was through the hallway, down the stairs, past wherever Brian was right now. The footsteps started climbing. Slow. Deliberate. He wasn't rushing because he knew she was trapped. Lily could hear him breathing. That heavy, excited panting that made her skin crawl, that confirmed every nightmare she'd had about what would happen if he ever got her alone. She pressed deeper into the corner of her closet, wedging herself between hanging clothes and shoe boxes, making herself as small as possible. Her phone buzzed. She nearly screamed. 2 minutes away. Don't make a sound. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Then another. He was close now, maybe 10 feet from her bedroom door. Lily's tears fell silently, hot tracks down her frozen face. She could hear him pause, could hear him testing doorknobs, clearing rooms. The bathroom, the spare bedroom. Each door opening and closing brought him closer. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it, that her terror had a sound all its own. Then his shadow filled her doorway, backlit by the hallway light, and Brian Kwan stepped into her bedroom. Victor's car moved through the empty streets like a blade through water, fast but controlled, every turn calculated, every acceleration measured. This wasn't the driving of someone fleeing or chasing. This was the precision of a man who understood that speed without control was just chaos, and chaos got people killed. The GPS showed 90 seconds now, the blinking dot is so close he could see the street, names matching the ones flying past his windows. He'd shaved 3 minutes off the estimate through shortcuts that only someone who'd grown up in this city would know, routes that didn't appear on any map. His phone rang through the car's speakers. Marco's name lit up the dashboard. Victor ignored it. Called again. Ignored again. His lieutenant would be worried. Would be running scenarios about why the boss had left alone in the middle of the night without explanation. But Victor didn't have time for explanations. The woman's last text still burned in his mind. I hear glass breaking downstairs. That had been 8 minutes ago. 8 minutes of silence since then. Either she was hiding successfully, or it was already too late. Victor pushed the thought away and focused on what he could control. The police. They would complicate things. Well-meaning officers would arrive with sirens and procedures and questions that would waste precious time, while lawyers got involved and evidence was documented, and a predator who'd broken into that house potentially walked away with nothing more than a restraining order. Victor had seen it happen too many times. The system was built for paperwork, not justice. He pulled up a disposable number on his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered with practiced calm. 911, what's your emergency? Victor's voice shifted, taking on the uncertain tremor of a concerned neighbor. I think I heard glass breaking at my neighbor's house on Maple Street. The address came out perfectly, coordinates locked in his memory. The operator asked for more details. Victor provided just enough to seem credible, but not enough to trigger an immediate response. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe just an accident. I'm not sure. Should I check on them? The operator assured him units were being dispatched, but advised him to stay inside for his safety. Victor thanked her and disconnected. 30 seconds. That call had bought him 30 seconds. Maybe a minute if dispatch was slow. Maybe 2 if the nearest patrol car was on the other side of their zone. It would have to be enough. He turned onto Maple Street, killing his headlights as the house numbers climbed. 12 houses down. 8. 5. There. The house was dark except for a single upstairs window, warm lights spilling out like a beacon. Victor's car slid to a silent stop 3 houses away. He checked his waistband, felt the familiar weight of the weapon he'd carried for 20 years, and stepped out into the night. The front door hung open, glass glittering on the back porch visible through the entryway. Victor didn't run. Running made noise. Instead, he moved like smoke, crossing the lawn in absolute silence, his entire being focused on the shadow he could see moving in that upstairs room. Brian Kwan stood in the center of Lily's bedroom, chest heaving, sweat darkening his shirt despite the cold night air streaming through the window he'd opened downstairs. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Hadn't been thinking clearly for weeks, maybe months. All he knew was that Lily belonged with him, that she'd understand once he explained it properly, Once she stopped ignoring his messages and his gifts and his love. She just needed to listen. That's all. Just listen without all those other people interfering, without her job and her friends and her ridiculous boundaries getting in the way. His breathing was loud, ragged, filling the small bedroom with the sound of his presence. He scanned the space methodically. Bed empty, sheets rumpled like she'd been sleeping. Bathroom door open, dark inside. That left the closet. Of course. Where else would she hide? Brian smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes, didn't soften the manic energy radiating off him. She was playing a game. Hide and seek. That was fine. He liked games. He took a step toward the closet, then another, his shoes heavy on the carpet. Inside the closet, Lily had stopped breathing entirely. Her lungs burned. Her vision sparkled with black spots. But she didn't dare inhale, didn't dare make a single sound as Brian's footsteps came closer. Tears streamed down her face in silent rivers, dripping off her chin onto her shirt. She was curled into the tightest ball possible, wedged behind her winter coats, knees pressed so hard to her chest that her muscles screamed. Her phone was clutched in both hands, screen dark now, useless. The stranger hadn't texted again. Maybe he wasn't coming. Maybe he'd realized this was insane, getting involved in someone else's nightmare. Maybe she'd die here in her own closet, found by police tomorrow after Brian finished whatever sick fantasy had brought him through her window. Brian's hand touched the closet door handle. Lily's heart stopped. This was it. The moment her life split into before and after. Before she knew what real terror felt like. After she learned what happened when monsters stopped lurking in shadows and stepped fully into the light. The handle turned slowly, Brian drawing out the moment, savoring his victory. "Lily," he said, his voice sickeningly gentle, almost tender. "I know you're in there. Come out. We need to talk. I just want to talk to you. Why won't you ever just talk to me?" His tone was reasonable, hurt even, like she was the one being unreasonable by hiding from the man who'd broken into her house at 2 a.m. Lily's body betrayed her. A sob hitched in her throat, small and strangled, but audible. Brian's breathing changed, quickened. "There you are," he whispered. The closet door started to open. Light spilled in through the widening crack. Lily squeezed her eyes shut and waited for her nightmare to materialize. Then she heard it. New footsteps. Downstairs. Calm. Measured. Coming up. Brian froze. The closet door hung half open, forgotten, as his entire body went rigid. Those footsteps downstairs weren't his imagination. Someone else was in the house. His mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had Lily called the police before hiding? Had a neighbor heard the glass breaking? Panic replaced his earlier confidence, that manic certainty evaporating like steam. He pulled back from the closet and turned toward the bedroom door, trying to decide whether to run or hide or talk his way out of whatever was coming. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. No voices. No radio chatter. Not police then. Brian's breathing grew even more ragged, that earlier excitement curdling into fear. He backed away from the bedroom door, eyes locked on the dark rectangle of the hallway beyond. Maybe he could explain. Maybe he could say he'd heard screaming, thought someone was in trouble, was just checking on his friend Lily. The lies formed automatically, practiced from months of excuses and justifications. He was good at lies. People believed him because he believed himself. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom. Brian could see a shadow blocking the dim hallway light, a shape that radiated presence even in stillness. Not a police officer. Too quiet. Too patient. Something else. Someone else. Brian opened his mouth to speak, to offer his rehearsed explanation, but before sound could form, the shadow moved. It happened faster than Brian's mind could process. One moment he was standing in the center of the bedroom, preparing his defense. The next, a hand had clamped onto his shoulder from behind with a grip that felt less like flesh and more like iron. Brian spun, or tried to, but the hand held him in place with surgical precision. He found himself staring at a man in a dark suit, mid-40s, face carved from stone and shadow. No expression, no anger, no urgency, just absolute, terrifying calm. The man's eyes were what Brian would remember later, in the handful of conscious moments he had left. They weren't empty. They were full of judgment and decision and certainty. This man had already decided Brian's fate before entering the house, before climbing the stairs, before placing that hand on his shoulder. Victor didn't speak. Didn't need to. His presence said everything. Brian tried to pull away, his earlier predatory confidence completely shattered, replaced by the sudden understanding that he'd become prey. He was taller than Victor, younger, should have had advantages, but none of that mattered. The hand on his shoulder might as well have been a mountain. Victor's other hand moved with practiced efficiency, catching Brian's wrist before he could swing, before he could fight, before he could do anything except realize that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. In the closet, Lily heard the beginning of a struggle. Brief, controlled. Then silence fell like a curtain. Brian's survival instincts finally kicked in, too late and too desperate. He thrashed against Victor's grip, throwing wild elbows and trying to twist free with movements that had no technique, no training, just panic given physical form. His breathing came in gasps and whimpers, sounds he didn't recognize as his own. He managed to wrench one arm free and swung hard at Victor's face, putting every ounce of fear-driven strength into the punch. Victor's head moved 3 inches to the side. The fist sailed past, hitting nothing but air. The counter was instantaneous and surgical. Victor redirected Brian's momentum, using the failed punch to spin him off balance, then swept his legs out from under him with a movement so economical it barely registered as effort. Brian hit the floor hard, carpet doing nothing to soften the impact that drove the air from his lungs. He tried to scramble up, hands and knees searching for purchase, but Victor was already there, knee pressed into his back, weight distributed perfectly to immobilize without crushing. Brian bucked and twisted, his movements growing more frantic and less coordinated with each failed attempt to escape. Victor's hand found the pressure point at the base of Brian's neck, fingers positioned with the precision of someone who'd studied anatomy not to heal, but to control. Brian's struggles weakened, his body betraying him as Victor applied just enough force to flood his nervous system with signals it couldn't ignore. No punches were thrown, no dramatic strikes, just quiet, devastating competence that reduced a grown man to helplessness in under 30 seconds. Brian tried to scream, to call for help, to do anything, but Victor's free hand covered his mouth, muffling the sound before it could fully form. The silence was absolute except for Brian's muffled breathing and the soft creak of floorboards under their combined weight. Victor leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying more menace than any shout could achieve. "You made a choice tonight. Wrong choice." Brian's eyes were wide, white showing all around the iris, his earlier confidence completely annihilated. He'd imagined himself powerful, imagined Lily would see his devotion and understand, imagined he was in control of this situation. Now he understood what real power looked like. It didn't need to explain itself. It didn't need to justify. It simply was. Victor applied pressure to another point, and Brian's consciousness began to fade at the edges, gray fog creeping into his vision. His struggles ceased, body going limp not from acceptance, but from simple biological shutdown. Victor held him there for another few seconds, making absolutely certain the threat was neutralized, then released the pressure just enough to keep him breathing but unconscious. Brian slumped to the floor, alive but removed from the equation as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Victor stood, adjusted his collar with hands that hadn't trembled once, and turned his attention to the half-open closet door where someone was still hiding in terrified silence. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds of struggle. Lily remained frozen in her corner, body locked in its protective curl, unable to process what she'd just heard. The footsteps, the brief, muffled confrontation, then nothing. Her mind offered terrible possibilities. Maybe Brian had won. Maybe he was catching his breath, preparing to finish what he'd started. Maybe the stranger who'd texted her was now unconscious on her bedroom floor. Maybe she was about to face something even worse than what she'd been hiding from. The closet door, which Brian had left half open, moved. Slowly, deliberately. Light spilled further into the darkness where Lily huddled, and she pressed herself harder against the back wall, knowing there was nowhere left to go. Her shaking had become uncontrollable, her whole body trembling like she was freezing despite the warmth of her buried position among winter coats. Tears continued streaming down her face, silent and endless. She'd cried more in the last 20 minutes than in the last 20 years. The door opened fully. Lily couldn't look up, couldn't bring herself to see which nightmare had found her. She squeezed her eyes shut and waited for hands to grab her, for violence or worse. Instead, she heard a voice. Calm, measured, completely devoid of threat. It's over. You're safe now. The accent was faint. The tone was gentle but not patronizing. It was the voice of someone stating a fact, not making a promise. Lily's eyes opened slowly, vision blurred by tears, and she saw him. A man in a dark suit knelt at the entrance to her closet, not looming over her, but lowering himself to her level. He was older, weathered in a way that suggested experience rather than age. With ink tracing his neck and hands in patterns she couldn't quite make out through her tears. His face carried no expression she could read, no anger, no pity, just steady presence. This was the stranger, the one who'd received her panicked text, the one who'd typed "I'm coming" and had actually meant it. Victor assessed the young woman in front of him with the same careful attention he'd given to neutralizing the threat in her bedroom. She was small, folded into herself like origami, every muscle locked in protective tension. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, shock settling in now that the immediate danger had passed. He'd seen this before, this moment when adrenaline stopped being useful and became just another thing the body didn't know what to do with. He reached into his jacket pocket, a slow, obvious movement that wouldn't startle her, and withdrew a pressed white handkerchief. He held it out, not pushing it toward her, just offering. For your tears. His voice remained steady, giving her something concrete to focus on, something normal in a night that had shattered every definition of normal she'd ever known. Lily stared at the handkerchief like it was an artifact from another world. Then, with shaking hands, she reached out and took it. Victor stood in Lily's bedroom 20 minutes later, examining the window Brian had used to enter. The young woman sat on her bed now, wrapped in a blanket, handkerchief still clutched in one hand, watching him work with the silent attention of someone whose reality had fractured and was slowly piecing itself back together. Brian's unconscious form had been removed, carried down the stairs and deposited in Victor's trunk with the efficiency of someone who'd handled similar cargo before. The police would find him eventually, somewhere far from here, with enough evidence planted to ensure he'd never threaten anyone again. But first, the window. Victor had already called one of his contractors, a man who understood that 2:30 in the morning work came with premium pay and zero questions. The temporary board Victor nailed into place would hold until proper repairs could be made at sunrise. He tested it twice, putting his full weight against the wood, ensuring no one else would be entering through this particular vulnerability. Satisfied, he gathered his tools and turned to find Lily standing behind him, blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor. "Thank you," she started, her voice hoarse from crying and fear. "I don't know who you are or why you came, but—" Victor raised a hand gently, cutting off the gratitude he didn't need and hadn't come for. "You texted. I answered. That's all." His tone made it clear the transaction was complete, that no debt existed between them. He moved past her toward the bedroom door, then paused. "Change your number. Don't tell anyone the new one for a while." Lily nodded, understanding that this advice came from experience she probably didn't want to fully comprehend. Victor descended the stairs, his footsteps as measured leaving as they'd been arriving. He'd already wiped down every surface he'd touched, a habit so ingrained it happened automatically. The broken glass from the back door glittered in the kitchen, evidence for the police report Lily would file in the morning, a report that would somehow be missing certain details. Victor let himself out through the front door, pulling it shut behind him with a soft click that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. His car waited 3 houses down, patient and dark. Victor slid behind the wheel and sat for a moment, letting the night settle around him. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the text thread. Her messages were still there, raw fear crystallized into words. His replies, sparse and certain. He read them once, committing nothing to memory because memory wasn't necessary, then deleted the entire conversation. The blinking dot on his GPS disappeared. The unknown number became unknown again. Victor started the engine and drove back toward his tower, toward his empire, toward the life where midnight texts from strangers didn't penetrate his carefully constructed walls. But something had shifted. Some part of him he'd thought dead had proven otherwise. As the suburbs gave way to city lights, Victor allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement that tonight, he'd been more than what he'd become. Tonight, he'd been what he'd once wanted to be.